In this video, we're going to review how to use the present perfect tense in German, and also learn about a couple new irregular verbs and how to use the past tense with modal verbs. First, let's look at some sentences in the present tense for the purpose of comparison. These are things that are currently occurring. Notice that the conjugated verbs are in normal position next to their subjects, second in statements, and first in yes or no questions. Now compare these sentences to their equivalent ideas, but this time expressed in the past tense. These are actions that have already occurred. Notice that in each sentence, the original verb has been replaced by a conjugated form of haben, and the original verb has both been moved to the end of the sentence and been changed slightly. It now starts with ge and ends with t. As you recall, the form of haben is known as the helping verb, and the other form at the end is known as the past participle. Using them together creates the past tense form known as the present perfect tense. Let's review how to create it yourself. Step 1 is to conjugate a form of haben for the sentence's subject, and to put this form of haben, the helping verb, in standard verb position. Step 2 is to create the past participle. This is done by adding the letters G and E to the beginning of the verb stem and the letter T to the end. Step 3 is to put the past participle at the end of its sentence or clause. Now let's go into a little more detail about creating that participle. As an example, let's take the infinitive verb hören. We'd remove the en to get the stem. The past participle of hören is therefore gehört. With the verb schmecken, we again remove the en and create the past participle geschmeckt. Now, let's look at these in full sentences. With a verb like sammeln, we could have a sentence such as Als Kind habe ich Briefmarken gesammelt. As a child, I collected stamps. The participle is at the end, and the helping verb, the conjugated form of haben, is in second position. It works similarly with other verbs. For instance, with lachen, we could say something like Der Film war lustig und wir haben viel gelacht. The film was funny and we laughed a lot. It's also worth noting that Rule 1 says the helping verb should go in standard verb position, not necessarily second. If we were to use a subordinating conjunction like weil or das, we'd have to move the helping verb all the way to the end of its clause. This means the helping verb would still be conjugated, but it would appear after the past participle, as in these examples. Ich finde es toll, dass du für mich das Geschirr gespült hast. Or with machen, ich bin traurig, weil ich die Hausaufgaben nicht gemacht habe. As you recall, this pattern of adding a ge and t to the stem to create the participle works for regular verbs, but there are a lot of irregular verbs out there that you'll just plain need to memorize. The good news is that you'll still need a conjugated form of haben in standard verb position for most, but not all, of these irregular verbs. More on that in a couple more minutes. The other good news is that the past participle will still go at the end of the sentence or clause, regular or not. But the tricky part is that the past participle itself is irregular, meaning it doesn't follow a predictable pattern the way regular verbs do. Here are some verbs you will have encountered so far, listed with their irregular past participles. Bekommen becomes bekommen, essen becomes gegessen, finden becomes gefunden as a past participle, geben goes to gegeben, gießen goes to gegossen in the past tense, helfen becomes geholfen, kennen becomes gekannt, mögen becomes gemocht, notice the G has changed to a CH, schlafen becomes geschlafen, schreiben becomes geschrieben by reversing the order of E and I, Singen becomes gesungen. Sprechen becomes gesprochen. Trinken goes to getrunken. Verbringen, as in to spend time, becomes verbracht. And ziehen, like in anziehen, becomes gezogen. As you know from your prior experience with the past tense, you need to memorize and practice these past participles until they feel natural. As an English speaker, though, you do have something of a leg up on these. You'll notice that the verbs that tend to be irregular in English also tend to be irregular in German. Not only that, but many of them tend to be irregular in the same way because the languages are somewhat related. Compare find and found to finden and gefunden, sing and sung in English to singen and gesungen in German, speak and spoken in English to sprechen and gesprochen, etc. There are some other exceptions or quirks that you might also recall. First of all, verbs that end in ieren, ieren verbs, do not add the usual ge to the beginning of the participle. For instance, sortieren would just become sortiert, not gesortiert. Telefonieren would just become telefoniert. Probieren would be probiert. Also, verbs with inseparable prefixes such as b, g, or ver, don't add a ge to the beginning of their participles either. So besuchen becomes besucht, gefallen becomes gefallen, not gefallen. Bestellen becomes bestellt, verbringen becomes verbracht with no ge. Finally, verbs with separable prefixes, such as an, auf, ab, aus, etc., put the ge between the prefix and the stem in their past participles. For instance, aufräumen becomes aufgeräumt, abräumen becomes abgeräumt, anziehen becomes angezogen, aussehen becomes ausgesehen. So far, we've exclusively been working with verbs that use haben as their helping verb in the past tense. Some verbs, however, use the helping verb sein. What verbs used with sein have in common is that they all indicate a change of location or state. These are verbs that, by their very nature, get the noun doing them from point A to point B, or condition A to condition B. Swimming is one of these verbs because doing that verb changes the subject's location. Falling asleep would be one of these verbs because doing that verb changes the subject's condition from awake to asleep. Also, none of these verbs will have direct objects. They're what's known as intransitive verbs. In fact, all transitive verbs, the ones that could have direct objects, will always take haben, whereas intransitive verbs must take sein as their helping verb in the past tense. Here are some of the verbs that will take sein that you've encountered so far. Fahren uses sein and becomes gefahren. Gehen also uses sein and becomes gegangen. Kommen uses sein and becomes gekommen. Laufen uses a form of sein as its helping verb and becomes gelaufen. Reiten uses sein and becomes geritten. Schwimmen uses sein and becomes geschwommen. Notice that in each case, the helping verb is not haben, but is instead a conjugated form of sein. This is because these verbs are ways to get from point A to point B, driving, going, running, swimming, etc. And doing these verbs inherently involves a change of location. Also, notice that the participles tend to be irregular. This means you'll need to practice these verbs a little more because they have both irregular participles and the helping verb sein. That's been a lot of review, so it's time now to talk about something entirely new that you may be wanting to try, using modal verbs in the past tense. For instance, you might want to be able to say that you had to do homework yesterday, or that you were supposed to make your bed, or that you wanted to go to the movies. Here are the past participle forms of the 6 modal verbs. They all take the helping verb haben, and you'll notice that they all have a G, E, stem, T construction, though the ones that had umlauts in their infinitive lose their umlauts, and mögen changes its G to a CH. Now, if you were to say something like, Ich habe gestern Leberkäse gewollt, or Ich habe den Film nicht gemocht, that would be fine, because you're not using another verb in those sentences, just a direct object. However, the other modal verbs will almost always be used along with an infinitive verb. And the German language has a very strict rule against using an infinitive next to a past participle in a sentence. In other words, we're not allowed to say, Ich habe mein Bett machen gemusst, because we'd have an infinitive right next to a participle. Because you can't do this, and because können, müssen, sollen, and dürfen are so rarely used without another verb, let's ignore their past participles entirely, since as it turns out, the solution doesn't involve the past participles at all. The solution is what's known as a double infinitive construction. It sounds a little goofy at first, but it's actually quite simple to do. Instead of putting the past participle of the modal verb at the end, you just put its infinitive form after the other infinitive. Using the helping verb haben makes sure your listener knows you're speaking in the past tense. Here are several examples of how this might sound. Wir haben gestern ins Kino gehen wollen. We wanted to go to the movies yesterday. Meine Großmutter hat nicht tanzen mögen. My grandmother did not like to dance. Ich habe die Hausaufgaben nicht machen können, denn ich habe mein Bett machen müssen. I couldn't do the homework yesterday because I had to make my bed. Lame excuse. Vorgestern hat es regnen sollen. It was supposed to rain the day before yesterday. And in der Deutschklasse habe ich kein Englisch sprechen dürfen. In German class, I was not allowed to speak English. Notice in these examples that the helping verb haben exists in each of them, and then there are two straight infinitive verbs at the end, with the modal verb being the second of the two verbs in every single case. Let's review what you need to know to create past tense statements and questions in German. First of all, for most verbs, you'll need to use the helping verb haben, and you will conjugate this and put it into normal verb position. For regular verbs, you'll create the participle by adding ge to the beginning and t to the end of the verb stem. This participle will go last in the sentence or clause. For an irregular verb, you'll just have to learn the participle because it doesn't follow the same pattern as other regular verbs and often involves a vowel change. Some verbs, ones that involve changing place or condition, will use the helping verb sein instead of haben. These also tend to be irregular verbs, so their participles will need to be memorized and practiced. Finally, there are some verbs that don't add ge to the participle, verbs that end in ieren or verbs that have inseparable prefixes. Also, separable prefix verbs will put the ge between the prefix and the verb stem. Finally, if you want to use a modal verb in the past tense, you'll need to use the helping verb haben along with a double infinitive construction at the end of the clause.